Hello students, welcome to the channel. In this video, we'll solve the fourth reading passage of the October 2020 US SAT. This is the social science passage. This passage is adapted from Jonah Berger, Contagious, Why Things Catch On. Although geography clearly matters in voting, the East Coast leans Democratic while the South skews Republican. Few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters. But it does. Political scientists usually assume that voting is based on rational and stable preferences. People possess core beliefs and weigh costs and benefits when deciding how to vote. If we care about the environment, we vote for candidates who promise to protect natural resources. If we are concerned about healthcare, we support initiatives to make it more affordable and available to greater numbers of people. In this calculating cognitive model of voting behavior, the particular kind of building people happen to cast their ballot in shouldn't affect behavior. But we weren't so sure. Most people in the US are assigned to vote at a particular polling location. Polling locations are typically public buildings, firehouses, courthouses, or schools, but can also be churches, private office buildings, or other venues. Okay, so this passage starts with saying that geography clearly has an influence on voting in the sense that we know how certain geographical areas vote. For example, the East Coast, the entire Northeast belt, New York, Boston, etc., it largely leans Democratic, while the South leans Republican. So yeah, we know that, but we don't think that the particular venue in which a person votes would affect his voting decisions, right? And that's because we think of voting as an activity that one does after having arrived at his or her choice after due consideration. So, which is to say that if we want to vote for a particular candidate, the cognitive model of electoral choice believes that people think about the pros and cons of voting for their candidate before deciding on how they are going to vote. But the authors of the study were not so sure, which is to say that they wanted to test if the venue in which one votes affects the voting behavior. And so they decided to test that. Different locations contain different triggers. Churches are filled with religious imagery, which might remind people of church doctrine. Schools are filled with lockers, desks, and chalkboards, which might remind people of children or early education experiences. And once these thoughts are triggered, they might change behavior. Could voting in a school lead people to support educational funding? So, the main idea that the researchers were going to test was whether voting in a particular venue might trigger memories, might trigger experiences that lead people to vote a certain way, right? So, for example, if you're in a school and you are reminded of your own time at school, then you might be more favorable to voting for, say, an educational initiative, right? So, this is what the authors of the study were interested in. To test this idea, Mark Meredith, Christian Wheeler, and I acquired data from each polling place in Arizona's 2000 general election. We used this name and address of each polling location to determine if it was a church, a school, or some other type of building. 40% of people were assigned to vote in churches, 26% in schools, 10% in community centers, and the rest in a mix of apartment buildings, golf courses, or even RV parks. Then we examined whether people voted differently at different types of polling places. In particular, we focused on a ballot initiative that proposed raising the sales tax from 5% to 5.6% to support public schools. This initiative had been hotly debated with good arguments on both sides. Most people support education, but few people enjoy paying more taxes. It was a tough decision. So, this describes the methodology that the researchers followed. They decided to look at data from Arizona's 2000 general election. And in particular, they were looking at this educational initiative, which involved raising the sales tax from 5 to 5.6% to support public schools. If where people voted didn't matter, then the person supporting the initiative should be the same at schools and other polling stations, but it wasn't. More than 10,000 more people voted in favor of the school funding initiative when the polling place was a school. Polling locations had a dramatic impact on voting behavior, and the initiative passed. So this employs statistical modeling, which is to say that if the venue didn't matter, then the proportion of people supporting the initiative should be agnostic with respect to the location in which people cast their votes. But that wasn't the case. When people cast their votes in a school, they were much more likely to support the initiative. In fact, more than 10,000 people supported the initiative when the polling took place in a school, and as a result, the initiative passed. This difference persisted even after we controlled for things like regional differences in political preferences and demographics. We even compared two similar groups of voters to double check our findings. People who lived near schools and were assigned to vote at one versus people who lived near schools but were assigned to vote at a different type of polling place, such as a firehouse. A significantly higher percentage of the people who voted in schools were in favor of increasing funding for schools. The fact that they were in a school when they voted triggered more school-friendly behavior. So this furthers the methodology that the authors employed, which is to say that they wanted to make sure that their results were robust. They accounted for differences in political preferences, they controlled for demographics, and they also controlled for distance from a school, right? It wasn't just that if somebody stayed near a school, then that person was more likely to vote for the initiative. They made sure that all of these factors were controlled. And yet they found that if you were in a school, then you tended to vote for the initiative. So there was definitely a positive trigger there. A 10,000 vote difference might not seem like much, but it was more than enough to shift a close election. In the 2000 presidential election, the difference between George Bush and Al Gore came down to less than 1,000 votes. If 1,000 votes is enough to shift an election, 10,000 certainly could. Triggers matter. So this is kind of a defense of the research. This is to counter a criticism that might turn up and say that 10,000 votes is not that big a number when you're looking at a national election. And to counter that, the authors say that, 10,000 is in fact a big number, because if you look at the 2000 presidential election, Bush beat Gore by a margin as slim as 1,000, right? So 10,000 definitely matters. So triggers are important. And then we have this table. So we'll come to this later. 31, which statement best expresses the main idea of the passage? The outcomes of elections can often be attributed to geographic variations in voters' values. Politicians exploit the triggering effects of voting venues to better their chances in elections. Voters' attitudes towards education funding are affected by the proximity of voters' homes to school. Voting decisions can be influenced by the surroundings in which voters cast their ballots. So D, right? D is the main idea, because this is a summary of what the passage intends to show, that the way you vote is affected by the surroundings, by the venue in which you vote. Okay, option A is not correct, because we know that outcomes of elections are affected by geographic variations, but that's not the main idea of the passage. The fact that politicians exploit the triggering effects of venues is not brought up, so B is wrong. And C is wrong, because we have categorically stated in the passage that it's not the distance of the voter's home from the school, but the venue in which the voter votes. So it's not C. As used in line 3, exact most nearly means. So this is exact. Although geography clearly matters in voting, few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters. The precise venue, the particular venue, right? Because exact here means precise, the particular venue. So this is a good answer. You're not talking about accuracy here, right? It's not about right or wrong. So B is wrong. You're not saying identical venue. Identical is used when you're talking about two things, so that's not right. And you're not saying the proper venue, right? It's not about whether the venue is proper or improper. It's about the exact, the precise, the particular venue in which one votes that affects voting behavior. The passage suggests that most experts who hold the traditional view of voting behavior would say that the school funding initiative in the 2000 Arizona general election passed because the majority of voters, and this is evidence-based. So we know that the traditional view of voting behavior is the cognitive view, which states that when people vote a certain way, that's because they have decided to vote that way after due consideration, right? So let's see, because the majority of voters believe that the initiative accorded with their reasoned views, cast ballots in venues with triggers that encourage them to favor the initiative, were exposed primarily to arguments supporting the initiative, voted for the initiative due to geographic factors. So it's A, right? Because the traditional view says that I have thought about something and I have come to the reasoned conclusion that I'll support it. So that's what A is saying. B is not the traditional view. B is the view that the passage supports, so it's not correct. C is not true. Nowhere in the passage does it say that in the traditional view, people vote a certain way because they're not exposed to arguments from the other side. And D is not correct. Geography matters, but that's not the traditional view, right? The traditional view is that you come to a conclusion based on how you have approached it with respect to your core values, etc. So A. And I think the answer would come from here somewhere, this part, right? Because this is the part where we spoke about the cognitive model of voting behavior. So the very beginning of the passage. So let's just look at the options. 1 to 4, 11 to 13, 25 to 30. Okay, so 1 to 4, 11 to 13. So I think it should be B, 25 to 30. Okay. And 46 to 47. This one, right? So let's just quickly look at each. Although geography clearly matters in voting, few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters. Right, so this basically talks about what the general view among people is with regard to voting behavior, but it doesn't talk about the traditional view of voting behavior among political scientists. If we are concerned about healthcare, we support initiatives to make it more affordable and available to greater number of people. In this calculating cognitive model of voting behavior, the particular kind of building people happen to cast their ballot in shouldn't. So this is the right answer because this is the cognitive model of voting behavior that we are talking about. This option, schools are filled with lockers, desks, and chalkboards, which might remind people of children or early educational experiences. This is the trigger view of voting behavior, so that's not the traditional view. And most people support education, but few enjoy paying more taxes. So this is that particular Arizona initiative, so it doesn't really answer the question about the traditional view. So which choice best illustrates the view referred to in the answer? Option B. In the passage, the author most directly characterized himself and his research team as displeased with certain political efforts to manipulate how voters behave, dissatisfied with the lack of general agreement on how voters think and act, unconvinced by certain assumptions about how voters make decisions, alarmed by the strength of their findings regarding how easily voters can be influenced. So I think this should be C, right? Because we know that they did this study because they were not sure that venue does not play a role, right? They were not sure about the assumptions underlying the cognitive model. In fact, it's given here, right? We weren't so sure. Most people in the US are assigned to vote at particular polling location. So we weren't so sure that the cognitive model is entirely true. We think that triggers matter. So they were unconvinced. So C is a good answer. They were displeased with certain political efforts to manipulate. There is no mention of voter manipulation. So A is wrong. Dissatisfied with the lack of general agreement on how voters think and act. No, this is a somewhat misleading option. First of all, there is no search for agreement in the passage, right? It's not that the passage is hankering for agreement among political scientists, and the lack of that agreement has not caused any dissatisfaction. So, very strong words, not supported by the passage. Alarmed by the strength of their findings? No, they were definitely not alarmed. And I don't think they're saying that our findings are very strong. They are in fact trying to justify their findings by saying triggers matter. So it's a mix. So C is the best answer. Which choice best supports the idea that many voters felt deeply invested in the outcome of the vote on the school funding initiative? Okay, 41, 44, 44, 45. 41, 44, 44, 45. Okay, 48, 50, and 63, 65. 48, 50, and 63 to 65. Okay. So the voters were deeply invested in the outcome of the school funding initiative. We need to look at that. Starting from this one. In particular, we focused on a ballot initiative that proposed raising the sales tax from 5 to 5.6% to support public schools. So this is the initiative, right? It doesn't really tell me how voters reacted to it. This initiative had been hotly debated with good arguments on both sides. Yeah, so this actually indicates that people were invested in it because it was hotly debated. People took part in those debates and there were good arguments. While like B, if where people voted didn't matter, then the person supporting the initiative should be the same at schools and other polling stations. So this doesn't really tell me voters' reaction to it and how voters were invested. So it's not this. And a significantly higher percentage of the people who voted in schools were in favor of increasing funding for schools. So again, this tells me the result of the initiative, but not voters' investment. So that's B. Okay, as used in line 54, dramatic most nearly means. Line 54, dramatic. Polling locations had a dramatic impact on voting behavior. Dramatic impact and outsized impact, more than expected, right? So theatrical, striking impact, something that was unexpected. So that's the best answer. Theatrical is the other meaning of dramatic in the sense of working in the theater, so that doesn't apply here. Abrupt is something that stops all of a sudden, so that doesn't really fit the context of a dramatic impact. And sensational is not correct in this context, right? I can talk about dramatic and sensational being the same when I'm talking about, let's say, a news story, right? Which was something that received a lot of attention. But here I'm talking about the location having a dramatic impact, so a striking, unexpected impact. So C. Which statement best describes the function of the last paragraph in the context of the passage as a whole? So this paragraph, right? The one in which they kind of defend their research by saying that even though 10,000 vote difference might not look like much, it is in fact a lot given what happened in Florida in 2000. It addresses a potential criticism of the author's argument by providing a context in which that criticism should be understood. It suggests that the author's findings may shed light on phenomena in fields other than political science. It concedes the existence of a significant exception to a trend identified by the author. It summarizes the argument that the author sought to overturn with his research. So it's A, right? The potential criticism that we spoke about is, why should we care about venues when the margin of difference between the winner and the loser was just 10,000? So the author addresses it by saying that, no, we need to care about that 10,000 margin difference. So A says that. The last paragraph does not speak about a field other than political science. So B is wrong. It doesn't concede the existence of a significant exception. In fact, it provides an example that supports the author's conclusion. So C is wrong. And it is not a summary of the argument that the author makes, right? This is definitely addressing a potential criticism. So D is wrong. Okay, which statement best identifies a weakness in the author's claim in the last sentence? So what was the last sentence? Triggers matter. So what is a weakness in that claim? Okay. The author restates the claim that triggers matter, but does so without having offered examples of triggers in the passage. The author characterizes his claim about triggers as innovative, whereas the passage as a whole suggests that many scholars offer similar explanations for voter decisions. The author states that a trigger influenced a particular election, but fails to provide evidence for this claim elsewhere in the passage. The author makes a general claim about the significance of triggers, but the passage provides evidence of only one instance of a trigger affecting voters' actions. Right, so it's D, right? D is a potential criticism and a strong criticism of the author, that, you say that triggers matter, you make this sort of overarching statement in your final sentence, and yet you've only provided one instance of the trigger affecting voters' decision with the educational ballot, right? Option A, the author restates the claim that triggers matter, but having done so without offering examples, that's not right. The author does offer an example with the educational initiative. The author characterizes his claim about triggers as innovative, but the passage suggests many scholars offer similar explanations. That's not true. The passage does not mention any other scholar that speaks about triggers. The author states that a trigger influenced a particular election, but fails to provide evidence for this claim. So this part is definitely wrong, right? He does provide evidence for how the trigger mattered in the Arizona educational initiative, right? So C is wrong. Okay, the table most clearly indicates that which statement is true of voters who lived within 0.2 miles of a school and voted in a school. Okay, so let's first understand the table. So this says increased percentage likelihood of supporting school funding initiative when voting in a school. Initial results and results after controlling for demographics. So increased percentage likelihood for all voters. So, okay, so big numbers even after controlling for demographics. Increased percentage likelihood for voters living within 0.2 miles of a school, and increased percentage likelihood for voters living within 0.4 miles of a school. So you can see that distance to a school is not such a big factor as just the venue being a school, right? So the probability that a person would vote for the initiative when they voted in a school was 0.845 before controlling for demographics and 0.788 after. While here it was a little over half, right? So, which is kind of supporting what the passage said about distance not being a factor. So people who lived within 0.2 miles of a school and voted in a school. Okay, so that was 0.583 and 0.560. This is the increased percentage likelihood. Okay, so 0.583 and 0.560. It is 0.560, right? Yeah, okay. They supported the school funding initiative at a higher rate than the voters who lived within 0.2 miles of a school and did not vote in a school. They demonstrated no change in likelihood to support the school funding initiative after researchers had controlled for demographics. They were more likely to support the school funding initiative than to support other initiatives in the election. They accounted for a larger percentage of voters in the election than did any other group of voters. Okay, so let's start by eliminating. So B is clearly wrong because we know that the likelihood of supporting changed after controlling for demographics. They were more likely to support the school funding initiative than to support other initiatives. There is no mention of other initiatives, so C is wrong. They accounted for a larger percentage of voters in the election than did any other group of voters. There is no comparative analysis of group of voters, so it should be A. They supported the school funding initiative at a higher rate than voters who lived within 0.2 miles and did not vote in a school. Okay, so those who did not vote in a school would be 1 minus 0.583 and 1 minus 0.560, right? And that would be 0.4 something, right? Yeah, so clearly the likelihood of supporting the initiative was higher than the likelihood of not supporting the initiative. So A is correct. Based on the passage, the data in the last row and columns of B and C of the table help the author and his team to last row, this one, and the columns B and C. So they helped the voter to kind of say that distance did not have a big impact, is what I think the answer should be. So let's see. Identify additional examples of the role of triggers in voters' decisions. Rule out alternatives to their explanation of voter support for the school funding initiative. Show that the outcomes of multiple elections support their hypothesis about voters' behavior. Explain why proximity to a school affected the decisions of people who did not vote in schools. So it's B, right? We know that the authors wanted to make sure that distance from school was not a factor. It's given here. Yeah, we even compared two similar groups of voters to double check our findings. People who lived near schools and were assigned to vote at one versus people who lived near schools but were assigned to vote at a different type of polling place, right? So it did not matter whether they lived close to a school, but what mattered was whether they were voting in the school. So the fact that these numbers were not very high, these numbers were not high, definitely as high as 0.788, indicates that they were able to rule out alternative explanations for triggers. So B. Identify additional examples. So no, they are in fact saying that distance from the school is not a trigger. So it's not A. This is not multiple elections. This is that one educational initiative. So C is wrong. And they're saying that proximity to a school did not affect broadly the decision of people. So D is wrong. So that was the last question, right? Yeah, okay. So let's grade this. Starting from 31. D double A B C B. D double A B C B. C A D A B. C A D A B. Okay, great. So we got all right. Hope this exercise helped. If it did, hit like and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you check out other video solutions for the reading passages of this test. After today's video, we are left with the fifth reading passage, whose solutions I'll upload soon. So come back and check that out later. I'll see you guys then. Take care. Bye-bye.